in the process of painting my house, and next on the list is the lounge. But before I start painting, I want to fix this crack in the plaster. Now I've got a lot of advice from people on how to do it, and I've watched a lot of YouTube videos, but I've never actually fixed plaster on a brick wall myself. So you're watching someone attempting this for the first time. So my name's Robin, and in the spirit of the channel, if I can, you can.
I knew this would be messy, so I put down a drop sheet. This was also there to stop any heavy pieces of plaster from denting the wooden floor as they fell. It's a horrible feeling ripping your walls apart. I was pretty nervous at this stage.
I hope so.
After getting all the loose plaster off, I chamfered the edge of the crack to help blend in the new render. I'm not sure if this was necessary, but it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Alright, I've pulled off all the loose plaster, I've used a paintbrush to get rid of all the loose dust, and I've cleaned the floor because now we've got to introduce some water to wet all the old plaster and bricks because they're extremely porous at this point and we don't want it to absorb too much out of the render too quickly.
The render I used was a generic acrylic render that gets mixed into water. You want to get this to about a peanut butter consistency.
Now is the moment of truth, and this is where the professionals would have no problem, but someone who's never done this before might run into a bit of trouble. What I've got to do is get the render into this crack, but leave it about 5 millimeters shy of the finished surface, because that's going to have to be done with plaster afterwards to get the smooth surface. The other thing is that I don't have a hawk, which is what you normally see people using. They hold it upright, it's got a square surface, and they can push the render on with that. But I do have a notched trowel, and for all intents and purposes, I reckon this is going to work pretty much the same. Yeah, I'm going to go add some more render. Alright, let's try that again. So now, it seems to be sticking on my trowel even when it's on its side. So I think I'm going to have better luck. Yeah, there we go. It's much better.
The issue here was the mix. I'd made it too thin. Fixing that, it started sticking to the walls properly. So for all of you out there who say you want to see more of the mistakes that I make get added to the videos, this one's for you.
So what I've found is that if I use the ridge on this trowel, I can dig it in just enough to take a couple of millimeters off the render just below the finished surface. And this is working because there's a slight curve on the trowel. I've given the render a couple of hours to dry, and it feels pretty dry to the touch. So I'm going to move on to the next step, which is to put on the finish coat. This is a premixed plaster, and it's just a very, very smooth texture to give you a nice final coat. Now to cover this render properly, I can't just apply plaster straight onto it. What I need to do is what's called feathering, and that's where you start applying the plaster further out, very thin, and slowly but surely get thicker and thicker into the middle, continue over it getting thinner and thinner. Because you're applying such a wide area, that means that it's going to be a lot harder to notice where the new and old plaster starts and stops.
The plaster went on really easily, and I was surprised at just how smooth you could get it without even sanding.
Now on the instructions it says to wait 24 hours before applying the second coat. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, that's dry. So obviously you wouldn't want to sand now, but I'm gonna go ahead and try adding the second coat on now. That way I can leave it overnight to dry and then I can sand hopefully in the morning.
On the second coat, I made sure to spread the area out even further to help it blend.
The second coat's on, it's 5 o'clock now, and I'm going to be able to leave this all the way through until about midday tomorrow. And I'm hoping it's going to dry enough in that time for me to be able to sand it. If I wake up in the morning and I can see where the crack is because there's a little bit of an indent as the plaster is dried, then I will have to apply another coat. But I'm hoping, looking at it now, we should be alright tomorrow to start with the sanding.
The next day I set up an electric heater and a fan, and that sped up the drying by quite a bit. I kind of wish I'd done this the day before.
It's the next day, the plaster is dried, and now it's time to start sanding. Usually you would use a sander that's made for sanding plastered walls, and the main thing is that it has a very large surface area. I don't have one of those sanding pads, so what I'm going to use is a 2x4 with a piece of sandpaper stapled on, and as you can see that gives you a nice large surface area. All this is going to do is going to flatten out any small bumps that the eye would notice quite easily, and if there are any undulations, this is going to make sure that you have very slow curves, which are a lot harder to pick up.
The sanding ended up being way messier than I'd expected. There was dust everywhere.
Now unfortunately I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to film for. This is really fine dust and it's going to absolutely kill my lens. It's already done it to one of them before. So we'll do a little bit more and then you guys are just going to have to use your imagination for the rest of it. Whew, that was a lot of dust. Okay, so after doing this preliminary sanding, there's still a couple of areas where the plaster has sunk into the render, which is fine. I was basically expecting that to happen. So what I got to do next is do another coat of the plaster, and this is going to be the final coat. So there's a lot of these little divots in the plaster, which I could keep sanding to get out, but then I'm going to lower the finish level further into the render, which is obviously what we don't want. So now I can take the plaster and do one more skim coat and catch everything, including these divots where the render is, catch everything in one go and get it as close to a finished surface as possible, so then the next sanding will hopefully not be as intensive.
On the next coat, I was a lot more careful about getting a smoother finish, and it helped so much when it came time to sand.
And that is pretty much that. For all intents and purposes, this wall is now ready to go. There are still a couple of divots in the wall that I will probably need to fix up later, but I have heard from a few people that this does happen. You tend to put the skim coat on, sand it, find a couple mistakes, put another skim coat on, sand it, find a couple mistakes. So a good idea now is to put a coat of paint on. Once the paint's on, you'll get a better idea of where it is, and then you can just fix up the smaller areas instead of just redoing the entire area again. So for now, the next step for me is going to be to paint. I'm not going to paint it in this video because obviously I've got to do the whole room, but this wall has gone from having a giant crack down the center to being ready for paint, and once I'm done, no one's going to even know that crack was there. What I would have done differently though is the plaster coat should have been done a lot smoother. So once I'd finished putting on the plaster, it should have been a lot smoother before sanding. That first coat I laid on so thick with so many lumps and bumps that sanding turned into an absolute nightmare. But if I put it on smoother, it would have been a lot easier to work with when it came time to sand. So this might have taken a little bit longer to do, but the cost was far less than it would be to hire a professional. Now don't get me wrong, a professional would obviously give you a much better result, but for someone like myself who does a lot of renovating on the house, I'm actually pretty happy with the outcome. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to put out a project video this week, and that's because I've recently had a major development, which has meant that I've got to put all of my time into renovating the house. I'm not going to give it away at this stage, but the Q&A video is coming up soon. Should be out in less than a week, and that will explain everything. So that's how you fix cracked plaster on a brick wall. My name's Robin, and if I can, you can. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and click that thumbs up. If you haven't already, would love for you to subscribe. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you guys soon.